6:02 a.m. My phone vibrates against the nightstand like a guilty conscience. I swipe it awake, half asleep, squinting at the name on the screen until the syllables print themselves into focus. Preston. I know the tone before he delivers it, the corporate tilt he uses when he wants to remind you who's in charge. He doesn't preface. He doesn't care to soften the blow. "You're too difficult to manage," he says. Flat, clinical, practiced. That's how it lands. Not a conversation, not a hearing, not even a genuine attempt at explanation. Just a verdict wrapped in a sentence that could, if you squint, be called a performance review. I sleep through the rest of the call like a careful actor feigning shock. Quiet, economical, but inside my head a ledger of 10 years flips open and counts the losses out loud. They fired me for being too honest. They said it like a diagnosis, as if I had a syndrome, as if candor were a defect you could quarantine. If you love corporate takedowns told with dark humor, subscribe. I sit up. The room smells like coffee I didn't make. Outside, the city is soft with dawn. Inside, my blood conducts a perfectly ordinary arithmetic of grief and calculation. This is not a tantrum. This is inventory. 10 years at Optima. Late nights, roadmaps, client dinners, where the real work got done between the bottles of bad red and the excusing laughter, have been cataloged by a company that reduced me to an adjective: difficult. The word is meant to delegitimize not only my voice, but the relationships I maintained like a second balance sheet. People imagine companies as buildings and servers and brand assets. They imagine the thing that makes a firm valuable is code, IP, product. For a decade, I lived in the invisible architecture, the creased Rolodex of trust, the ability to smooth a worried investor's panic with a 5-minute call and a single sentence. I was the nervous system. Not in the poetic sense, literally. I knew which partners to alert at 2 a.m. when a fund blinded the market. I knew which junior analyst to pull aside when a spreadsheet didn't add up because she was new and afraid to speak. Preston, bless him, is the kind of VP strategy who believes strategy is a deck with a catchy title and a headcount with a familial origin story. He's Richard's son. Richard Vance, the CEO, is a gentleman who learned the hard lesson that sometimes loyalty is less valuable than the echo of it in the room. He has a face that looks like the company thinks it looks, steady, reassuring, earnestly flawed. He doesn't understand why losing me hurts them. He thinks replacing him is hiring a checkbox. They wanted a checkbox. They didn't want candor. There are 2 reactions to being told, in the earliest hour, that you're surplus to requirements. You either flame out spectacularly, sending a mess of texts and emails that burn bridges for sport, or you do something measured and surgical, something that leverages every legitimate asset you hold.
I let the text messages stay unsent. I poured water over the coffee maker like a person washing evidence, and then I went to the one place I always go when numbers and personalities have to be reconciled: my head. This is where the too honest joke curdles. Honesty in business isn't bluntness, it's a covenant of expectations. When you tell a client something that is uncomfortable but true, you are not being needlessly harsh. You are preserving capital, credibility, and time. Optima had built a portfolio on that hidden currency, and in dismissing me, they'd signaled that the ledger on which they'd been thriving was, in their minds, replaceable. The first 10 minutes after termination are a curious blend of theatrical grief and forensic precision. You wobble between feeling small and running through possibilities like a chess player checking endgames. I tell myself the story I need. They are afraid. Fear whispers as a rationale when leadership is failing. It points fingers at inconvenient truth-tellers. Preston's line about difficult to manage is a defensive reflex, which means their hand has slipped. Good leaders silent honest voices because they don't want to be held accountable. Bad leaders fire them to show power. Either way, it's a confession. You read the quiet patterns in that confession. I don't scream. I don't slam doors. I do the thing I do well under pressure. I listen for the sound of the room. For 10 years, I had built lifelines. Not literal cables, but the kind that matter in a crisis. Warm relationships with partners, trust from allocation committees, a quiet reputation for delivering on promises. People who trusted me didn't sign off because the legal team had a stamp. They signed because when I promised a meeting, I also promised the person on the other end that if things went sideways, I'd be there to study the damn boat. That trust lives in email threads, in meeting notes, in the habit of showing up. It's not a database you can back up with a contract addendum. I make my way downstairs. The kettle moans, the cat, who knows nothing of corporate karma, winds herself around my ankle. I make a list in my head. What's gone, what's likely to be revoked immediately, and what survives the moment of dismissal. Reports? Probably locked. Access to accounts? Maybe gone by the time I step outside. But relationships? Those are slower to sever. They outlast passwords and policies, because at their root, they're human. There is a narrow window between termination and total account revocation. It's not a license to trespass. It's an opportunity to be strategic with the assets you legitimately control. Your voice, your network, your reputation. There are people you can call. There are offers to be made. There are reputations that will relearn who they owe allegiance to if presented with a clear alternative. It's not elegant. It's leverage. It's the adult version of fighting on a chessboard instead of flinging a chair.
I put on a shirt that isn't wrinkled. I sit at my kitchen table, the laptop open like a patient that expects no mercy. I write a single, tightly worded email to myself. Things to do right away. It's not dramatic. It's a to-do. Coffee, call Marcus, update LinkedIn. Each task is surgical, intended to preserve clients, not to humiliate anyone. Marcus Thorne is not a charity. He's the regional director at Apex Capital, Optima's most aggressive competitor, with an appetite for market entry points and a nose for talent that unsettles incumbents. Marcus and I had been in the same orbit for years, at conferences, panels, one too many client dinners. He respects competence. He dislikes nepotism more. When I call him, he picks up on the third ring. "Dana," he says, like a close friend and not the predator of a rival firm. "You all right?" "I'm fired," I say. The word lands less like news and more like confirmation, for being too honest. A grin I can hear over the line. That's the best firing speech I've heard in a while. Come to Apex. Now, here's where the moral squint matters. I could have called Marcus and said, hunt for leaks, drag them. I didn't. There's a difference between orchestrating a coup and moving your life forward with intention. I told him what he needed, the value proposition of bringing me on, the fact that clients trust me, and, crucially, that there were investors who prefer competence over comfort. We negotiated terms in the language of professional survival: salary, title, non-disclosure sensibilities. There are things you don't burn, even when you're rightfully angry. Your reputation is not a match to set offices ablaze. Apex moved fast, the way predators must if they want to claim a carcass. They offered me a role that was more than a consolation prize, a seat at the table. It felt oddly vindicating and perfectly banal. I took the offer, not out of crude revenge, but because time and competence are not meant to be wasted. Leaving Optima was neither theatrical nor petty. It was arithmetic. Back at Optima, the morning unfolded as bad theater. I watched from the periphery as the company's internal rituals kicked in. Legal counsel drafted language, HR wrote neutral paragraphs about organizational restructuring, and Preston practiced a face that read as regret-free. They sent their formal notice with the precision of a machine, the sentences balanced to avoid admitting fear. Far from me, at a desk that had been mine, a junior analyst named Chloe received the echo of the disruption in the form of late notices and uncertain schedules. Chloe had been the kind of once hopeful analyst who stayed late because she believed meritocracy was real. I had coached her on more than models. I taught her which investors favored conservatism and which liked a little optimism. She was collateral in a leadership drama she'd never auditioned for. Leaving Optima meant making hard choices about the people who would be affected.
I slept on the couch for a night, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I didn't want the first mattress I lay on after the firing to be a symbol of triumph. There was guilt. There was also a clear-eyed recognition that the most responsible thing to do was to minimize harm, not to paralyze myself in indignation. Within hours of my departure being obvious, I did what people who survive in this business do. I controlled the narrative on networks where narratives matter. LinkedIn is a mercy and a weapon. It is where careers are franked and reputations either sink or sail. I wrote a post that was crisp, honest, and spare, a paragraph that said nothing vindictive and everything true. Gratitude for a decade, clarity about the next steps, and a professional note that I'd be open to conversations about stewardship of client relationships. The wording was deliberate, Tone matters. Fury reads badly in clip form. Confidence, however, travels like a heat signature. I did not pen an op-ed lambasting their leadership. I didn't leak internal memos. I used a platform I had legitimately earned through years of sharing insights, not grievances. The post, in less time than it takes to brew a second cup of coffee, did what good posts do. It seeded curiosity. People messaged. Some were perfunctory. Others were not. The first DM came from an allocation manager I had worked with for years. "Are you okay?" it read. The second was from an investor with enough assets to make a person consider renting a modest island. The message was, "We need to talk." Investors don't ask questions lightly. They ask the uncomfortable ones quietly, and then act. I felt the posture of the room shift. There is a difference between investor outreach and investor panic. The former is routine business. The latter is an atmospheric pressure change. My post, carefully constructed, modestly strategic, didn't create chaos. It revealed a tension that had been there all along. Companies sometimes mistake control for stability. In truth, perceived control is a fragile veneer. When someone who is known as the fulcrum of relationships steps away, it exposes how much of the business was being held together by the promise of continuity rather than structural strength. At Optima, the response was procedural terror. People who had never had to be decisive suddenly had to announce decisions. The IT staff, quiet, competent people who run on caffeine and mute buttons, started sending status updates with a tone I recognized from others who didn't know how to contain panic. I felt a pang for them because they were, in many ways, innocent. Chloe texted me a message the size of an apology and a request for advice. I answered without theatrics. Keep your head down. Do the work right. If they ask for your help to fix what leadership broke, document everything. It was the least I could do. I did not want my leaving to be the cause of anyone losing their footing. Human systems react unpredictably. My LinkedIn post became the match that revealed the Tinder. Investors began to reach out in private. Not all of them, just the ones who had watched me work and knew the cost of a misplaced leadership decision. One message stood out. Arthur Sterling. The name reads like a headline. He is the type of investor that moves markets, not with bluster, but with decisive reallocations. He calls less and does things that cause boardrooms to clear their throats. The message was short, intentionally so. Lunch? Underneath, nothing. No preface, no preamble. I knew the implication. I also knew the risk. Meeting with someone like Artiker without a plan is like going to a duel without reading the terms. But I also know appetite when it slides onto the table like an open check. I didn't answer publicly. I composed myself, then texted Marcus. "Arthur might be available. What's your schedule?" Marcus responded in the tone of someone who sees windows and builds glass. "Meet him. Bring a plan." And there, in the pause between one life ending and another beginning, the real decision presented itself. I could play revenge as theater, go on a rampage of humiliation that would make for a good anecdote at dinner parties. Or I could treat this as a professional pivot, move where the assets, human capital, relationships, reputation, could be preserved and amplified. The difference is not ethical nitpicking, it's stewardship. The people who would be hurt by my choices were not just Preston or Richard. They were junior staffers like Chloe, the IT folks, compliance officers who would have to explain why a shift hadn't been noticed earlier. Reckless vengeance would create unnecessary harm. Surgical movement would aim, at least in theory, to minimize collateral damage. I drafted 3 responses that night, one to Arthur accepting lunch with a neutral tone, one to Marcus confirming a path to onboarding and a frank conversation about ethics, and one for my former team, an open, careful message that said thank you, and where needed, I am available. Each message was an act of rebranding and guarantee, not of money, but of professional reliability. There are things a person can control in moments like this. Their reputation is one, their next employer is another. The rest is noise. The next morning, Optima's internal comms department sent out the sanitized statement. "We thank Dana for her contributions and support her in future endeavors." It was the kind of sentence that reads polite and hollow because it skirts the actual truth, that previously trusted relationships were now in flux. The board received a terse note from a small faction of nervous investors asking for reassurance. Reassurance is an interesting word in a market. It connotes a kind of transactional faith that can be bought with numbers, not personalities. Investors started scheduling calls for the following week. A few of them asked to preserve a certain discretion. In places where discretion is currency, my anonymity as the catalyst helped them act without signaling panic. By noon, messages had multiplied. One of them read simply, "We'd like to move our allocation to Apex." Another, from a younger fund manager, said, "How can we make this transition smooth?" These were not threats. They were options laid on the table. A CEO who assigns loyalty by family ties and PR statements might have thought those options would remain theoretical. They didn't. The market moves because people move their capital to places they trust. I am not a person who delights in spectacle. My satisfaction, when it comes, is precise and somewhat clinical. It is the knowledge that competence, when positioned intelligently, has more staying power than the breathless confidence of nepotism. Still, there is an ember of guilt that flares when I read Chloe's note about being forced to pick up extra shifts. I call her in the afternoon and spend 20 minutes listening to her. She is scared. She mentions Preston's firm hand in passing, and I hear something like regret in her voice. You deserved better, I tell her. It's small consolation, but it matters. I give her my private number. I tell her to call when she needs to. She says, be careful. The words are for me, but they contain the weight of everyone who would be swept up in a storm of corporate failure. That evening, I sat across a small restaurant table from Marcus. He was precise in a way I liked. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He did, however, outline a vision. Apex is a place where competence is rewarded, and relationships are the company's invisible balance sheet. He said, if we do this, we do it right. No theatrics, no scorched earth. We give clients a choice and make sure they understand it. We agreed on the language we'd present and on the contingency plans we'd prepare, not to terrorize anyone, but to ensure clients had a clear, professional path if they chose to move. I left the restaurant riding a careful high. It was the sensation of standing at a hinge, the familiar world on one side, a new set of responsibilities on the other. Back home, my inbox contained 3 substantive voicemails. One of them was from Arthur Sterling's assistant. Lunch this Friday, she said. Private, no press. The other 2 were from investors asking practical questions, and one, from a compliance officer at another firm, offered to introduce me to someone who could help clients transition their holdings efficiently and ethically. This was leverage, yes, but not of the incendiary sort. It was leverage in the most boring but effective sense. Options. Options for clients who trusted me, options for employees who needed a dignified path, and options for my own career. The danger in leverage is the temptation to use it to punish. I resisted that temptation because punishment corrodes reputation the way acid corrodes metal. It is satisfying in the immediate and ruinous in the long term. A message arrived from Gerald, Optima's general counsel. The subject line read like a weather report: urgent, compliance and contractual obligations. There was a tone of officialdom, the kind you get when a legal team wants to preserve appearances. The body of the message was standard: reminders about non-disclosure, references to non-compete language, and a request for a call. In every corporation, legal letters are the smoke that signals someone believes the fire of reputation can be contained with the thunder of paper. They are designed to scare people who don't have counsel. They also sometimes signal panic. I forwarded Gerald's message to Marcus and to Apex's general counsel, Sarah, with a 1-line note: heads up, expect noise. Sarah replied with the kind of calm that only in-house counsel can muster. We will review, she wrote. No rash moves. We'll document everything. This is important. Legal threats are part of the scenery in these narratives, but they rarely determine outcomes on their own. The real mover is trust. If clients trust you, legal letters become bluster. If they trust the other party, those letters might slow momentum. Either way, they create a drama that boards and CEOs hate because it reveals vulnerability. That night, I lay awake thinking of Richard, the CEO. He is not a cartoon villain. He is a man who wanted to believe in stability as a principle. He would later tell the board that firing me was necessary to send a message. That phrase, send a message, is the bone of many failed decisions. It implies management by theatrics instead of management by competence. I felt a strange pity for him then, and a more complicated emotion toward Preston. Preston, who had been handed a role too grand for his experience, was a symptom. He was nepotism incarnate, enthroned by affection, not aptitude. When I closed my eyes, I didn't dream of bringing the company down. I thought instead about how fragile the scaffolding of businesses can be when the scaffolding hides itself as culture. You can build $1 billion fund, but if your governance assumes an unearned silence, it will one day discover that silence is an expensive illusion. 2 days after my post, the ripple had become a current. Investors scheduled private calls. Marcus made introductions. A compliance officer put me in touch with a vendor who specializes in transitions. The volume of messages becomes its own pressure. Each time someone asked a logistical question, my instincts cataloged the human stakes: Chloe's extra shifts, IT's late-night scrambling, the compliance officer who had to defend a board to people their colleagues might never again respect. I was careful in every interaction. I avoided gloating.
I reframed my departures as opportunities for clients and as a chance for colleagues to find clarity. I told myself this was not revenge. It was stewardship. But I will admit to something else. There was a dark, precise satisfaction in watching a leadership decision that mistook truth-telling as a liability start to unravel, not with noise, but with investor discretion. Vindication doesn't need fireworks. It can arrive as quiet reallocations and a few telephone calls that change the math. Late that week, I received an invitation from Arthur for lunch, confirmed through the assistant. Friday, private room, no reporters. The subtext was clear. He likes to keep his moves private until they're decisive. A private room is where serious reallocations get discussed because it gives participants a chance to talk frankly without PR breathing down their necks. I told Marcus. We spoke for 20 minutes about tone and content. Marcus's counsel was direct. Don't sell the story. Listen. Let him lead. That advice was smart. Investors talk in a language of allocation, risk, and continuity. You listen to them. You understand their pain points, and sometimes you help them craft an exit that doesn't look like a betrayal. Then, 2 days before lunch, an analyst friend sent me a message with a screenshot of an internal rising concern. Optimus Board was scheduling a special session to review recent leadership changes. The screenshot wasn't anything damning, yet, but boards move like glaciers. When they shift, they break things. Watching a board schedule a session is not the same as watching a storm break, but it's a sign that the weather is changing. I put my phone down and walked over to the window. The city was a smear of lights and distance. I thought about Chloe, about the IT folks, about the compliance officer and the junior analysts who would be caught in the crossfire if things escalated. I felt the familiar ethical pinch. Any move I made carried consequences for people who hadn't chosen this fight. I also felt the precise satisfaction that competence evokes when leveraged for a purpose. It is not the joy of seeing misfortune. It is the steady contentment of a baker who sees a loaf come out of an oven and knows the recipe worked. When Friday arrived, I dressed deliberately, not to provoke, but to present a composed person. Not an avenger, not a martyr, not a provocateur. I entered the restaurant with a posture calibrated to say, I'm here to talk about stewardship, not to gloat. Arthur Sterling met me with a handshake that was warm and slightly predatory. He is a man who gives praise like currency and uses it to buy confidence. You're a difficult person to fire, he said, smiling in a way that showed he was pleased by the notion of being in on the truth. Some people build resumes, I said. I built lifelines. He laughed, but not unkindly. Tell me, he said, why did they let you go? That is the question. In answering it, I did not rant.
I mapped the truth, a pattern of leadership that prioritized image over outcomes, nepotism disguised as legacy, and a failure to recognize who actually owns client trust. I spoke plainly about the risk of allowing a company to confuse loyalty to a person with loyalty to a process. Arthur listened as though each sentence was a data point. When I left the restaurant, I had not signed a check, nor had I made any promises, but there was something in his eyes, a calculation, that suggested he saw options. Options that, given a little courage, might mean moving a significant allocation. I did not celebrate. I texted Chloe to check in. There will be a moment in this story when the consequences of these conversations become public. A scheduled call, a question from an investor that opens a wound, a board member fumbling for answers. For now, the work is quiet and careful. It involves meetings over food, careful language, and the slow arithmetic of trust. I made a plan. Preserve dignity, minimize collateral damage, present options to clients, and let the market do its thing without theatrics. I also resolved not to enjoy humiliation. Pride, after all, can be a cruel housekeeping tool. It clears your conscience of guilt while it sweeps others into the dust. That evening, as I prepared notes for a call with a longtime client, a new message arrived. It was short, typed by someone who rarely speaks without purpose. We are reevaluating allocations. Can we schedule a call? The send time was 10:47 p.m. It is the digital version of a tap on the shoulder in the dark. I looked at the message and felt the ledger tilt. This is how markets change. No one momentous event, no single broadcast, but 100 small, decisive choices. Somewhere in the corporate offices of Optima, the people who had voted for the send a message strategy were now dealing with a different class of message. Investors, like bees, follow where the nectar is real and reliable. When the hive senses a crack in the honeycomb, it moves. The narrative so far is simple. They fired me for honesty. I offered competence in return. What follows will be about whether competence is enough to tip the scales when reputation and money begin to migrate. For now, the story sits on a hinge. The tiny motions, lunches, messages, quiet calls, are building pressure. Pressure expands. Things that seem stable begin to show stress fractures. I closed my laptop and made myself tea. There is a comfort in small rituals during upheaval. They don't fix outcomes, but they steady the hands that must make the choices. Outside, the city breathed on, indifferent and patient. I climbed into bed with my phone turned face down. Somewhere a board was stirring. Investors were rereading old emails. Chloe might be taking a late shift. In the morning, I would prepare for a call that could set several dominoes wobbling. I know the shape of these things. I have spent a decade translating whispers into decisions.
The most dangerous thing a person can do here is confuse righteousness with a strategy. My aim was not to ruin anyone for sport. It was to protect the people and relationships that had been quietly managed and to hold leadership accountable for mistaking optics for governance. The rest would be decided by other people's choices: Arthur's appetite, investors' willingness to reallocate, and a board's courage to look truth in the face. When I finally rested, it wasn't peaceful in the way of oblivion. It was a tired, cautious sleep, the kind that comes when you know tomorrow you'll have a meeting with a man who moves markets, and you will have to say the right thing, willingly or not. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of gravity that has nothing to do with weather and everything to do with schedules aligning. Arthur's assistant called with a time and a room number that read like a possession. Private dining room. Discretion requested. She did not say how much. That, I knew, would come later in the way investors always tell the truth, economically, without embellishment. I went with Marcus. He sat across from me and watched Arthur like a man reading the angles of a chessboard. The food was deliberate. Small plates, wine measured as punctuation rather than indulgence. We didn't need theatrics, we needed clarity. Arthur spoke in quiet sentences that had the weight of an accountant and the temperament of a man who had learned to move money without the noise of press releases. He asked one simple thing at the start, as if he were setting the terms for a negotiation that would be danced rather than bargained. Did they understand what they had? He asked. They didn't, I said. They thought a name and a title were the same as continuity. Silence, then a nod. He didn't say much longer. He never did. Investors, especially the large ones, don't fill air with promises. They test for risk and appetite and then move. Over the next hour, we talked about thresholds, how much of a portfolio could be moved without creating a headline, what discretion would look like, and how the clients would be handled so that their exposure would be limited and their fiduciary duties preserved. I made one request. We do this with care. No leaks, no hissed warnings that would set off a panic. He agreed. 2 days later, a message arrived that never read like a boast because it was the kind of business confirmation that lands like a cold handshake. We are initiating a partial reallocation, $80 million. The sum did not sing. It altered tone. The room changed its tempo. Actions like that do not happen in a vacuum. They set off motions in the parts of the market that care about reliability. Overnight, whispers became calls. An investor here, a family office there. People who had been watching the quiet work I had done for a decade understood the arithmetic. When a trusted steward leaves, the cost of staying becomes a question of governance, not sentiment.
Boards hate that question because it forces votes they never expected to cast. Optimus' reaction was what you would expect from a firm startled into movement. Legal memos circulated with urgent subject lines, the tone of which screamed containment, and PR teams drafted statements that tried to say nothing definitive while sounding measured. Preston did interviews with his practiced smile. Richard issued a line about organizational realignment that to me read like the public exhale of someone who had just been asked to explain why he fired his engine. Gerald's letters, which had been lawyers' rainstorms, blunt, procedural, designed to make people freeze, multiplied. He used every formal phrase in the book, reminders of obligations, requests for confirmation that data or contacts had not been misused, warnings couched as compliance checklists. They were meant to intimidate. They were also, to anyone who has read enough corporate legalese, largely performative, tools to buy time, to sow doubt. I forwarded each one to Sarah at Apex. She read them and then replied with the sort of counsel that pragmatists love. Document everything. Keep us apprised. No confrontations. There were, of course, offers to appear conciliatory. Optimus HR tried to find an amicable wording for the exit. Board members called with the tone of people ambushed by their own patience. Richard left a message for me that sounded like a man whose script had been taken from him. "Dana," he said, voice layered with something between regret and exasperation. "We made a difficult decision." "We made a lot of decisions," I answered gently. "Some of them didn't cost much. This one will." The crunch came on a sunny Thursday that should have been ordinary. It was the quarterly earnings call, a ritual that turns executive language into public currency. Optima had scheduled it weeks earlier, a perfunctory parade of numbers and forward guidance. For them, it was a moment to soothe. For me, it was an opportunity to watch what happens when governance stumbles into daylight. I did not go looking for the spectacle. The call was public. Many of those who had been quietly speaking to me would later acknowledge they were listening. Arthur did not make a bombastic announcement. He never had. Instead, he asked a question, one that, delivered in the clinical tone of a portfolio manager, sounded innocuous until you considered its implications. "Can you explain how leadership evaluated the continuity risk associated with recent personnel changes?" he asked. You could hear the room change. It is a strange sensory thing, the way executive breathing tightens, the way corporate confidence thins. Richard answered first. He seemed to have the rehearsed calm of a man who believed the right phrases could compensate for a missed architecture. He talked about strategic direction, about streamlining, about positioning for growth.
It sounded like a CEO reading a deck he hoped would hold when the wind came. Then Arthur pushed. He asked for specifics, how they had quantified client retention risk, what mitigation steps had been put in place, and whether the board had been briefed. The questions were not incendiary. They were precise. Preston, sensing the needle, leaned into a defensive posture that revealed more than it concealed. He spoke in generalities and used phrases that had the smell of rehearsed bravado. We made a disciplined choice, culture realignment, fresh leadership energy. His sentences were polished, but their edges were thin. An analyst followed, and her question was simpler still. Is the company experiencing any unforeseen reallocations? The question landed like a probe. There was a pause. Richard, who up to that point had been steady, hesitated. He used a phrase that deceptively sounds like control. "We are monitoring flows." That is the language of damage control. It's the kind of sentence that is meant to reassure, but in a market reads as acknowledgement. The call, which had been intended as a comforting cadence of numbers, turned into a series of hesitant answers and guarded phrases. Within hours, trading reflected worry, not outrage. Price movement is rarely dramatic and theatrical at first. It creeps. People move money discreetly to avoid looking scared. But a seed had been planted. The market sensed governance tension. Meanwhile, the internal life of Optima was fraying in ways that felt painfully human. Chloe's messages multiplied, concerned texts, questions about payroll procedures, short notes that read like someone carrying a weight they didn't deserve. She was not the only one. HR sent memos asking managers to reassure staff. Finance scrubbed schedules for contingencies. Comp-anxious calls peppered the day. I felt responsible in a way that was more complex than satisfaction. Those moves I had helped catalyze were not the same as the daily work of a support team. People like Chloe did not ask for a corporate drama. They came to the office to do a job, and now they were doing it under flickering lights. I called her between meetings and heard a tiredness that made me want to apologize, even as I knew there was no apology adequate enough for structural failure. "We're doing this the right way," I told her. "Document everything, prioritize your well-being, and if you ever want a hand, call me privately." She said later, haltingly, that she'd been approached by someone at Apex who wanted to offer a temporary contract. I gave her the recruiter on the spot. Recruiting internally, helping people move their careers rather than using them as pawns, became a quiet priority. I asked Marcus to have HR at Apex look at roles for a few folks who were directly affected. He grumbled in the way men who are playing saviors sometimes do, but he moved.
Sarah, his general counsel, and Sarah Miller, Optima's compliance officer, a woman of exacting standards who had been quietly suffocated by institutional preferential treatment, had a conversation that changed the texture of the fight. Sarah Miller had been the kind of compliance officer who believes in rules because they protect people, not because they can be used as cudgels. When she reached out to me, it was with a tentative curiosity rather than ideological rancor. She asked about options. I suggested she speak to Apex's compliance folks under a mutual non-disclosure. Within a week, she had come over, not with crowbars and leaks, but with files and frameworks that would make transitions cleaner for clients who had voted to move. If money is the weapon of markets, people are the scaffolding. As individuals shifted, stability eroded.
Board members who had been comfortable with narrative started to ask hard questions. A faction of investors demanded a special review. The tone of investor calls shifted from curiosity to concern. Gerald's memos, which earlier had served as intimidation, now read like an attempt to stop a flood by pointing to a valve. You could see the boardrooms where lawyers and PR teams attempted to stitch a narrative together, but narrative is a poor substitute for governance. Words fail when the calculus of capital changes. The second act of the drama came with a leak. Not a grand exposé, just a throwaway line in a trade publication, something about significant reallocation tied to Optima. It did not name Arthur, it did not name Apex, it said nothing particularly precise, but in the logic of markets, the hint was enough. Momentum is made of small pushes, tiny decisions, 1,000 private calls. Within a day, a few other mid-sized funds announced reviews. People I had worked with over the years called not to gloat but to confirm. "Are you okay?" they'd say. I would answer, as honestly as I could, yes, this was always about stewardship. At the center of the storm, Richard's confidence unspooled in public ways. A board that had tolerated a management style based on sentiment rather than process suddenly realized that their governance had liabilities. A special meeting was scheduled. Whispers about succession planning, always a feverish subject, began to circulate. Preston, who had been appointed with parental confidence rather than merit, found himself on the defensive more than he had been prepared to be. He leaned on talking points like a man clinging to a script he hadn't mastered. On the street, employees began to whisper. The kind of gossip that eats at culture arrived with a slow, steady hunger. The staff who had believed in the myth of meritocracy began to see that the myth had been curated by comfort. People like Chloe had to reconcile the idea that their work had value even if leadership had misread its cost. That reconciliation was messy and human.
The cost showed up in late shifts, in calls from anxious families, in resumes quietly updated at kitchen tables. I did not take pleasure in their pain. I took actions to mitigate it. I asked Marcus to consider temporals, retention offers, and introductions. We didn't want to pull people out of Optima in a way that would create mass exodus and panicked headlines. We wanted to be practical, to offer places of refuge for those who were swept up by decisions they did not make. For every investor who called to reallocate, I insisted on a line about staff continuity. Ironically, the same investors who moved money also wanted to preserve key people. They didn't want to be the reason someone lost a job. They wanted to be the reason a person had a chance to survive professionally. Then came the call that would be its own kind of public crucible, a town hall-style Q&A, where major investors tuned their questions to be on the record. Arthur did not always speak publicly, but when he did, his words were clear and economized. He asked the kind of question that required a board to reveal its thinking about stewardship and continuity. The CEO's response, which Richard intended us steal, read as a misstep. He attempted nuance, and nuance died under pressure. How does the board reconcile firing critical relationship management talent with assurances to clients about continuity? Arthur asked. A silence fell. Richard's answer was a mosaic of strategy phrases. It displayed the kind of leaderly optimism that had seemed functional in brighter markets, but looked thin now. Then Preston authored a line meant to be robust. "We have new hires in the pipeline." That sentence, intended to comfort, read like a confession. The market does not value future hires, it values known relationships. Within hours, 3 public shareholders had sent formal inquiries. Media outlets began to frame the story as governance failure. Headlines ask blunt questions because they are easy to parse. Investor exodus? Leadership in question? The language hardened. The most consequential moment did not arrive in a courtroom or a rumor mill. It came in a voicemail that made 2 things clear. The market listens to capital, and capital listens to trust. Arthur called and asked a single, decisive question. "Are you prepared to let us move?" It was a question about logistics, but more importantly, about permission. He wanted the mechanics to be discreet and the movement to be proportionate. I said yes. The reallocation proceeded with the careful choreography I'd insisted on. It landed as 80 million moved. Significant, not spectacular, but enough to change the conversation. When people with influence move money, others follow. It is rarely immediate. Migration is a cumulative art, but the signal had been sent. The consequence was both immediate and slow. Board members felt pressure. Confidence bled into uncertainty. Clients and the margin, watching risk-reward equations shift, made calls.
A handful of important meetings were rescheduled, then canceled. The stock, never a rigid indicator of value, but of sentiment, reacted. The public narrative framed the firing as a symptom. On the inside, people began to see that sending a message had cost the firm more than the PR boon it intended. Richard, who had always measured himself as the calming presence, now had to answer for a decision that looked impulsive. He defended the choice in board meetings and, behind closed doors, was questioned by trustees who had been comfortable with his stewardship until they noticed that their hands were not as steady as they believed. The board convened emergency sessions. Governors who had deferred to him now pressed for explanations and for a plan that showed competence beyond its optics. Preston's career unraveled faster than he seemed to expect. He had been handed a ladder without the architectural knowledge to climb it safely. In public meetings, he stumbled over questions he should have anticipated. In private, he relied on the reflexes of someone who confuses loyalty with governance. The more he spoke, the clearer his limitations became. People are not sacked by private inadequacies so much as public revelations. The tide of investor discomfort brought his inexperience into focus. There was legal theater. Gerald's memos became more pointed, the tone curdling from reminder to concern. Threats of injunctions and claims about non-compete clauses were tossed like flares. They were intended to frighten and distract. Apex's counsel, Sarah, responded with the cool professionalism of someone who has seen threat letters count for little when the market is the arbiter. She insisted we proceed in a way that minimized risk but did not cower. Her voice was calming, the kind of voice that costs less than panic and more than bravado. A small tragic moment arrived when an overworked IT specialist at Optima, someone who had spent nights patching errors and making sure client platforms behaved, received a terse termination notice. He called me with a voice that had thin humor and a lot of exhaustion. "We always thought we'd be a family," he said. "Turns out we were a spreadsheet." I felt the cheapness of that line and the cruelty behind it. I did what I could. An introduction, a referral, a note to HR urging humane transitions. In that small human way, I tried to soften the edges of a corporate tempest. And then the board made a move that was as predictable as it was decisive. They asked for a leadership review. The governance speak on the memo read cleanly: process, review, independent assessment. But in the undercurrent it meant one thing: someone would be asked to step down or be repositioned. Investors wanted to see accountability. The board wanted to signal competence. The result was the same. Richard negotiated an exit. It was not a dramatic firing, not a late-night ambush.
It was a slow erosion that culminated in a resignation that read like a gentlemanly departure, but landed publicly like a capitulation. Preston, whose name had become shorthand for nepotistic entitlement, was reassigned to a consulting role that had significantly fewer responsibilities and far more oversight. The language was neutral. The effect was career-limiting. Boardrooms are not kind to those who mistake family ties for governance. When the news broke, quietly, via a press release that attempted dignity, the market reacted in a way that was both humane and brutal. The stock dipped, investors exhaled in various degrees of relief. People who had been confused now had a pivot. For some, it was too late. For others, it was an opportunity to attempt a reset. My own victory was quietly complex. Marcus offered me a role with a title that contained enough authority to be meaningful and enough responsibility to be dangerous in a good way. We brought over a handful of people: Sarah Miller, whose compliance chops would steer transitions ethically; Chloe, who accepted a cautious contract that gave her breathing room and a steady paycheck; two IT folks who were tired of being scapegoats for leadership myopia. These moves were not a conquest, they were a reconstruction. I moved into a small office that overlooked a different block of the city. It was not the triumphal suite one sees in movies. It was practical: a desk, a view, a credible chair. The people who came with me had bruises and resumes, and a hunger to be in a place that valued their work. We spent the first week not celebrating, but sorting. We organized client transition plans that prioritized continuity, pro bono consulting for small teams that had been dislocated, and a careful approach to messaging that would not inflame headlines. It was dull work. It was the work of stewardship. There were, of course, moments that felt sharp. A reporter called with a question about whether we'd poached clients. I answered frankly. We offered clients a choice. They made their own decisions. Journalists like moral clarity. Markets like options. People like dignity. I did not take solace in any fireworks. The public sagas of leadership come with collateral damage that lingers. Chloe sent me a long message months later about the relief she felt in a role where her work mattered without being a stage prop for someone else's agenda. She had steady pay and a sense of agency. She also lost colleagues who had not been able to transition quickly enough. She mourned them with an honesty I understood. I wrote back with the kind of sympathy that acknowledges limits. We did what we could, I said. It wasn't enough for everyone. That line sat in the middle of the ethical residue. It was, and still is, true. There was a small private act of reparation. Arthur, who prefers to avoid fanfare, quietly assured the transitioned employees that their contracts would be honored as part of the reallocation terms.
He did not do it to be kind in a sentimental way. He did it because good stewardship and talent retention served his interests. I wrote him a note afterward, short, earnest, and not sentimental. He replied with a line that read like a balance sheet. Good people are hard to find, harder to keep if leadership is careless. Hard, honest, and mercenary, exactly the kind of truth markets respond to. People asked me later if I had taken pleasure in the collapse. The question always implied a theatrical vengeance, an appetite for ruin. That was not my experience. The satisfaction was quiet and surgical. It was the knowledge that systems that rewarded artifice over competence would, given the right incentives, be corrected by capital. It was also, importantly, an awareness of the price paid by people who never asked to be part of any narrative. Joy gave way quickly to the work of making reparations where one could. There were legal skirmishes, optics, letters, and the occasional threat of litigation. They were in the end less determinative than one might imagine. The cost of pursuing legal action for reputational theater is often greater than the benefit. Boards prefer to change narratives rather than litigate them into oblivion. I am not a lawyer. I am someone who learned to make decisions that prioritize continuity. I hired counsel, and I made sure every step we took at Apex was defensible and principled. That is the only legal advice you'll get. Do what you can to be above reproach and document it. Months later, when the dust settled into something that looked like a new order, I sat in the same office and looked at a city that still did not care for our petty human dramas. The skyline was honest in its indifference. That was its mercy. We hired a small team to manage transitions ethically. We created frameworks for clients who wanted to move without dramatic headlines. We offered job placements and consulting hours to teams displaced by the shakeup. It was humble work, and it felt necessary. There were moments of quiet recognition. An old client, one I had wined and negotiated with for a decade, sent a note that said, simply, "You were the reason we stayed for so long. We stayed with you." That sentence was simple and heavy. It was the sum of years of telephone calls, late-night problem-solving, and personal investments in trust. It vindicated a kind of labor that the market often overlooks until it is absent. My victory was not a crowning one. I did not dance on podiums. I received instead polite congrats from peers and a small increase in responsibility. My title was less important than the work, steward. That word meant I had a duty not just to profit but to preserve dignity. It also meant I now had to live with the consequences of how my actions, however carefully chosen, affected lives. There were conversations with people I respected where the moral calculus was not tidy. "Did you consider the full cost?" they'd ask. I tried to be honest. "Yes," I said. "I considered it and accepted that some damage was unavoidable if we were to correct a systemic neglect. It is the hard arithmetic of stewardship. Sometimes the cleanup costs more emotionally than the action did economically." Richard's public departure was handled with a kind of civility that belied the fractures beneath. He left with a statement about new opportunities, and the board announced steps to strengthen governance. They hired an interim CEO with a track record of disciplined decision-making. Preston was quietly moved into a role where he could be mentored or marginalized, depending on how you view succession in corporate families. People made different assessments. Some saw justice, others excess. I saw governance recalibration. In the months that followed, a slow and steady thing happened. Clients who had moved began to experience the difference. They found that continuity could be engineered with respect, that transitions, in the hands of competent people, could be humane. They appreciated that trust is not a line item, but a sustained practice. Our small team at Apex built processes that were less showy and more honest. And yet, even with all the practical victories, there remained an ache. I walked past a small cafe one morning and saw a group of analysts, some of them former Optima staff, laughing quietly over coffee. I felt gratitude and a pinch of grief.
People were resilient. They are always more resilient than boards give them credit for, but that resilience often comes with scars. One evening, months after the dust had settled into the new order, Chloe sent me a file. It was a little collection of notes and a short memo she had once written about client outreach protocols. She had saved a line I'd told her once: keep the phone line warm and the email colder. She added a note to the document: you saved us. I felt foolishly moved, and for the first time in the arc of the story, I let myself feel something that was not strategic. It wasn't triumph. It was relief. There is a temptation, when narrating these things, to paint them in monochrome: us versus them, savior versus villain. That is lazy storytelling and leads to lazy ethics. Richard was not a monster. Preston was not simply a buffoon. Gerald was doing his job in a way that protected a company he thought he loved. Arthur was applying capital where he believed it would be stewarded. Chloe was trying to keep her life moving. The truth in corporate narratives is always complicated. People are seldom wholly pernicious or wholly pure. Systems, however, can be designed poorly and then reinforced by habits, and habits by incentives. That is the real problem, and the real victory is when governance is corrected. I kept a small ritual after the whole ordeal: a late-night call with my oldest friend, a former colleague who had used the same industry to build a quieter life.
We would trade stories and sometimes laugh at the absurdity of how people behave when they think they are entitled. He said once, with a sympathy that was sharp, "You were the list." It landed on me like a statement of both pride and burden. You were the list, he meant, because I embodied the relationships and the loyalty others assumed came from hierarchies. They came from human things: showing up, being honest when honesty mattered, and holding people's anxiety with the kind of patience that cannot be fired by a single sentence. When a company ejects its conscience as if it were toxic, it sometimes finds its balance sheet is paper without root. Months later, I stood in front of a small group of newbie recruited colleagues and told them what I had learned. I didn't deliver a manifesto. I stayed practical. I said, people remember how you make them feel before they remember what you told them. It is true. Details fade. Memory remembers tones. On the day of my first review at Apex, a small group of us, new hires and those who'd moved with me, sat around a battered table. We talked about governance, about client transitions, about how to prevent what had happened at Optima. We wrote policies that prioritized staff continuity, that required redundancy for critical relationship roles, and that forced boards to consult with the people who actually held client trust. Policies are not panaceas, but they are scaffolds. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Richard had listened instead of acting. Would Optima have been stronger? Possibly. Would Chloe have had a quieter week? Probably. The difference between leadership that listens and leadership that acts from spectacle is not small. It is the difference between a house built by consensus and one built by a single confident hammer. I do not tell this story to relish anyone's downfall. I tell it because systems matter, and because the ostensible reason for my firing, being too honest, is a phrase that reads like satire until you realize how often it is used to silence people who are inconvenient for the comfortable. Candor in a corporate context is not rudeness. It is stewardship. It is calling a risk out when the room prefers applause. When the markets finally stilled into a new rhythm, the immediate drama faded. Optima existed, reconstituted under new leadership. Some people stayed, some left. The firm recalibrated. We continued our work at Apex, less glamorous, more attentive. On a quiet afternoon, months after I'd first listened to Preston's flat line of dismissal at 6:02 a.m., I found myself on a slow walk, phone in pocket, thinking about how odd it is to be defined by a single sentence someone else utters. I had been too honest, according to a man whose greatest asset was a practiced smile. The sentence had the unintended consequence of exposing the fragility of an entire building. I keep my phone face down most of the time now. Occasionally, it vibrates, and the name on the screen is someone who owes a call. Sometimes it rings with a message of thanks. Once, someone I had helped transition sent a photo of her new desk with a note, "Still can't believe we did it." I replied, "You did." If there is a lesson from this without becoming moralizing, it is twofold. First,
Competence has a way of lasting longer than inherited privilege when supported by capital that values stewardship. Second, when you decide to act, aim to minimize harm, because reputations, like markets, are not only about profit, they are about people. I do not glory in anyone's collapse. I celebrate, quietly, that stewardship was vindicated and that a few good people found steadier ground. The rest is theater I avoid. The revenge people imagine, fireworks and humiliation, was never mine. My satisfaction was, and remains, a precise sort of quiet, a recognition that truth, when wielded ethically and coupled with action, can correct incentives without becoming spectacle. Sometimes I think about that first phone call in the small hours, Preston's flat, practiced line, and how it changed everything. It is a strange thing to be fired for honesty, and to discover that honesty was the one real asset the company couldn't afford to lose. If you stayed with me through this, there's more to unpack. Lessons about negotiation, about managing transitions, and about how to protect teams when leadership fails. If you want that deeper dive, subscribe and follow the socials. I'll share a behind the scenes on what to do when governance tilts and how to keep the people you care about from becoming the cost of a leadership lesson.